Hi, I'm Lynora. And while I was hooked up to chemo, trying to hold on to my life, my grandparents handed over everything I was supposed to inherit to my sister's husband. No warning, no conversation, just a signature. They called it, "What's best for the family." But how do you survive the kind of betrayal that comes dressed in Sunday dinners and birthday cards? And if they were planning for my death, why did they act like I never existed at all? What else had they signed away behind my back? Hospitals always smell the same, sterile, sharp, and just a little too clean, like they're trying to scrub away things that can't be erased. I was still groggy from my first chemo treatment, drifting in and out of a sleep that never quite took. The nurses had adjusted the bed to an angle that left me watching snowfall outside a small window, the flakes hitting the glass like they didn't want to stay either. Elawan was sitting by the window, one leg crossed over the other, dressed like she'd just come from a PTA meeting. Hair perfect. Nails perfect. Her phone buzzed once, twice, then she muted it without glancing down. "Just a little paperwork, sis," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "They need signatures to make sure we can help if anything comes up, especially if you're too tired to deal with it." I didn't think twice. Elawan had always been the organized one, the one who remembered birthdays and brought cranberry sauce from scratch on Thanksgiving. I trusted her. So when she handed me the pen, I signed. My hand trembled a little, but I didn't read past the first page. I didn't ask questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the way she didn't meet my eyes when I signed. I brushed it off. The chemo made everything feel distant, like I was watching my own life underwater. The next morning, my phone buzzed as I stirred awake. A message from Elawan. "Love you. Rest well today." I smiled faintly. Then, another notification. A text from Jordan, a high school friend I hadn't seen in years. "You seen this?" It was a link to an Instagram story. Tobias, Elawan's husband, smiling wide, standing next to her in a showroom, admiring granite countertops. She was in the same outfit she'd worn yesterday when she sat beside me. The caption read, "Our dream home coming together." Dream home. The phrase clung to the back of my throat like syrup gone bitter. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe they were just picking out options, in case something happened. Maybe Elawan needed an outlet. Still, I felt something tighten in my chest. That evening, I took slow steps through the hospital hallway, holding on to the railings, determined not to call for help. I passed a woman speaking to a nurse about power of attorney. Something about the phrasing jolted me. When I got back to my room, I reached for the folder Elawan had left behind. I hadn't looked at it since signing. As I flipped through the pages, my breath caught. Buried on the second page, in neat legal print, it read, "Successor beneficiary, Tobias J. Corbin." I read it again, slower. Then a third time. It was like a switch flipped in my brain. My limbs still weak, my stomach knotted from the chemo, but suddenly the fog cleared just enough for the pieces to click into place. A memory surfaced. Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. We were all in the living room. I'd just offered to handle Maureen and Harlan's property taxes that year. Tobias had laughed and said, "You're too responsible for someone without a mortgage." Elawan chuckled, squeezing my shoulder. "That's why she'll be the one to take care of things when we're older." Back then, it sounded like a compliment. Now it felt like a prophecy. The next day, I asked to speak to the clinic's social worker. She was kind, young, maybe late 20s, wore glasses too big for her face. She pulled up the scanned document on her computer. "Yes, you signed a durable power of attorney," she explained. "It gives medical and financial decision-making to your proxy, should you be unable to make those decisions yourself." "And the proxy is?" I asked, though I already knew. "Elawan Corbin," she said, "and if something happens to her, it defaults to Tobias J. Corbin." She looked at me with sympathy, her words slowing. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, lips tight. "Yeah, just making sure I understand." Back in my room, I sat by the window. Snow still drifted outside, quieter now. I watched a squirrel leap from one branch to another, like the cold didn't bother it at all. I whispered, to no one, "They think I won't make it." For the first time since this started, I allowed myself to consider that they might not be waiting for me to get better. They might be planning for me to go away, quietly, conveniently. As the sky outside turned from gray to black, I started noting things down. Who had access to my insurance? When Elowen stopped asking about my treatments, the name on the document, because something told me this wasn't the end. It was the opening line in a story they hoped I'd never live long enough to tell. They weren't waiting for me to recover. They were preparing for me to disappear. That thought lingered like the chemical taste in my mouth after chemo. Bitter, hard to shake, and somehow just as invasive. A few days had passed since I discovered Tobias's name, typed neatly, as my successor beneficiary. I tried not to overreact, tried to keep my mind grounded in facts. But truth doesn't always come in shouts, it whispers. And sometimes it whispers through the wrong doors. It happened during a slow walk down the hall for physical therapy. I was gripping the rail, trying to convince my legs they still belonged to me, when I heard her voice, Elowen, just around the corner. I froze. "She's not going to make it through March," she said. Her voice was low but steady. "Just push it through. Nobody's going to question it." Silence. Then Tobias's laugh came faintly through speakerphone. "Understood." I didn't make a sound. I couldn't. My breath stalled in my throat. My grip tightened on the metal railing like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I waited until I heard their call end and their footsteps move away. Only then did I allow myself to move again. Back in my room, I didn't cry. I just sat there, hands clenched in my lap. The betrayal didn't scream. It pulsed, heavy and dull. I wasn't just being written off. I was being planned out of the picture. 2 nights later, Maureen invited me for dinner. Said it would be nice to have a full table again. I almost declined. But something in me, maybe the part that still hoped for answers, said yes. The house smelled like roast chicken and thyme. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. The seating chart told the whole story. I was placed at the far end, next to the sliding glass door where the draft seeped in. Elowen sat center left, Tobias at her side. They looked like the poster couple from some rustic home magazine. Tobias held a wine glass like it was a prop. Elowen beamed when anyone looked her way. I was the one person she never glanced at. Conversation flowed around me like I wasn't there. Harlan discussed next steps with the land, and Tobias nodded along like it already belonged to him. Maureen chuckled from the other end of the table, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin. "It's good to know things will stay in the bloodline," she said. No one noticed I didn't touch my food. Or maybe they did and didn't care. I left early, didn't say goodbye. Just slipped my coat on and drove home alone. The radio played an old gospel tune. I didn't catch the words. My mind was too busy repeating one question over and over. When did I become a guest in the family I was born into? That night, I couldn't sleep. My body ached, not just from treatment, but from being erased in plain sight. I tried to remember the last time I felt like Elowen had my back. My mind drifted to the attic. We were kids, maybe 10. We used to play in Maureen's attic, wearing her old scarves and costume jewelry. We made up elaborate dinner parties and crowned ourselves co-queens of the castle. Elowen always picked out the tiaras. She liked being seen. I liked the quiet corners where we laughed at our own jokes. Now she sat at the head of a real table, beside a man who'd mapped out my absence, like it was part of a budget plan. And I was shivering near the door, forgotten. A few days later, I overheard another conversation. This time, it wasn't accidental. I was walking past the open window to Harlan's den. I heard him clearly. "Better you than some social worker when she passes," Tobias answered, his voice calm. "We'll do what's best for the family." They spoke as if my life was an estate, something that needed settling, something temporary. That evening, back at the hospital, I went to unpack a few things from my overnight bag. At the bottom, tucked between a sweater and a pill organizer, was a folded note in Maureen's handwriting. It read, "No matter what happens, you will always be my granddaughter. But we have to think of legacy too." I stared at the page for a long time. It wasn't meant to hurt, but it did. I didn't tear it. I didn't scream. I just folded it back up and held it in my hand like it might still offer warmth. Legacy, I realized, wasn't always about love. Sometimes it was about control. Some truths don't scream. They hum softly, waiting in the background until you're still enough to hear them. It was close to midnight when Morgan, an old friend from back home, dropped off my things at the hospital. A beat-up duffel bag, a half-eaten protein bar she forgot to remove, and at the bottom, my old laptop. I hadn't touched it since the diagnosis. My energy had been consumed by treatment plans, insurance battles, and pretending I still belonged in a family that no longer acknowledged my place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept scrolling through old files, trying to keep my mind busy. Somewhere in a forgotten folder labeled Thanksgiving, I found it. A video, unsent, stored in my grandmother Maureen's email drafts. Her face filled the screen, framed by the floral wallpaper in her den. She looked tired but clear-eyed. "My home, my assets, my legacy," she began, "will be split equally between my granddaughters, Lynora and Wen. That's what love looks like. That's what fairness means." She paused, blinked at the camera like she was deciding whether to say more, then hit save instead of send. I stared at that screen for a long time. I didn't cry because it hurt. I cried because, for the first time, I felt seen. And that feeling is its own kind of ache. The next morning, I called Maureen. I didn't bring up the video. I just asked why everything had changed. She sighed heavily. "Sweetheart, we raised you. We paid for your college. We did everything we could. But Wen has a family now, a husband, children. You understand, don't you?" She didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "Sometimes legacy demands hard choices. It's not personal." That's the thing about people who choose silence over honesty. They assume silence equals understanding. After the call, I opened a drawer full of old bills, printouts, and envelopes. Over the years, I'd paid for the roof repair on their home, covered 2 ER visits for Elowen's youngest when insurance didn't, co-signed Tobias's small business loan before his name had any real value. And I did it without asking for thanks. But now I needed receipts, not for money, but for memory. I spent the rest of the afternoon pulling together every record I could find. Shared expenses, proof of transfers, texts from Elowen asking for a quick favor. I labeled each one carefully, like pieces of a puzzle only I had ever seen the full shape of. That night, Tobias called. It was past 10. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail I listened to on speaker while I folded laundry. "Let's not make this ugly," his voice said, too calm. "There's no point clinging to something that's already been settled. You've got enough on your plate with your health. We all appreciate what you've done. But don't ruin the peace, Lynora. That wouldn't be good for anyone." He hung up like that was some kind of wisdom. I opened my laptop, pulled up the video from Maureen, and clicked save. Not in drafts. Not in forgotten folders. On my desktop, center screen. Then I opened a new folder. I named it Ghosts. Inside it, I placed everything. The video, bank statements, screenshots of messages, the mortgage forms I'd helped co-sign for Tobias. Years of invisible giving, finally gathered where no one could pretend they didn't exist. I didn't send anything. Not yet. But I renamed the video file, The Truth They Forgot. Sometimes truth doesn't just surface. It has to be summoned, document by document. I wasn't sure what stung more, realizing they'd planned for my absence or learning they'd already moved on from it. Late February brought an unusual warmth to Spokane, the kind that tricks you into thinking winter might be done, when really it's just taking a breath. I was at the outpatient lab, waiting to get blood drawn before my next round of chemo. The nurse walked up with a manila envelope, smiled and said, "Test results, hun." Her voice was too cheery for what I knew was coming, but I thanked her anyway and tucked the envelope into my lap. Back in my room, I peeled it open slowly. The paper inside wasn't a lab report. It was crisp, heavy stock, legal. I recognized Maureen and Harlan's signatures before I even read the title. Property Transfer Agreement. The recipient, Tobias J. Corbin. The address listed? The lakehouse my grandparents once promised would be mine. The same one I helped paint the shutters on every summer during college breaks. It was already done. My hands went cold, fingers trembling like they weren't sure whether to tear the paper in half or frame it as proof of what I'd been too afraid to believe. It wasn't a plan anymore. It was a transaction. Signed, sealed, delivered. Later that afternoon, I made an appointment with Vince Marwood. His office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same green carpet, same photos of his 2 sons, same dusty law books that no one touched anymore. He didn't offer a seat, just glanced at the paper, then at me, like I was interrupting his dinner reservations. "I see," he said flatly. "See what?" I asked. He hesitated, then leaned back. "The will was revised. You're no longer listed." I held his stare. "When was it changed?" He shifted in his chair. "Around the time you were first admitted to oncology." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, stood up, and thanked him. I watched his face twitch as I walked out, like he wasn't sure if he'd just seen a ghost or a lawsuit. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket wrapped around me. It was too cold to be out, but I needed space that wasn't lit with fluorescence and pity. I typed out a message to Elowen. "We need to talk. This won't end quietly." I stared at it for a long while, then deleted it. Instead, I opened a blank document and began writing a letter to Maureen. "You erased me on paper. Let's see how that holds in real life." My fingers didn't tremble this time. Somewhere around midnight, I found myself thinking about the guest house. 3 years ago, I'd spent the better part of a month repainting it, scraping off old blue paint, rolling on fresh coats of cream and sage. Harlan had watched from the steps, coffee in hand. "We'll leave this to you girls," he said, nodding at the house. "You're the only ones who actually show up." That sentence used to make me proud. Now it felt like a cruel joke with my name cut out of the punchline. Before bed, I took a picture of the transfer document and scanned it to my laptop. Then I opened a new folder and named it Revision 1. I didn't stop there. I opened my email and drafted a message, one I didn't intend to send just yet. The subject line read, "If they push." The body was blank, except for an attachment and a single line. "You built a story without me. I'm just returning the missing chapter." They pushed, so I pushed back, just not the way they expected. March arrived like a slow bruise. No visible impact at first, but the ache deepened each day. I walked into the hospital billing office to double-check my insurance and treatment schedule, thinking it would be routine. Just another checkpoint in a life filled with scans and schedules. The woman at the counter was polite, almost too much so. Her smile flickered as she reviewed my file. "Looks like your support fund has been restructured," she said, tapping her keyboard. "The trustee on your account authorized a disbursement shift. You'll need to follow up with Tobias Corbin for details." I nodded once. No outward reaction. But inside, the air changed. I didn't ask questions. I just walked out. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew. Later that day, I got a call from Evan, a friend who worked in the records department at the county clerk's office. We'd gone to community college together and stayed in loose touch. He'd always been a bit of a snoop, the good kind. "I ran your name through the database after seeing your post about hospital fraud," he said. "There's an LLC registered under your birth date. Lynora Corp. Filed right after you were hospitalized. Guess whose business address it links to?" I didn't respond. I didn't have to. "Tobias," he answered himself. That bastard made a whole company under your name. Legally, it's clean. Morally, that's another story. I hung up and stared at the wall for a long time. They hadn't just pushed me aside. They'd made me into a ghost they could profit from. Not even a hidden trust or a back door will change. They built a shell around my name and filled it with everything I should have inherited. The next afternoon, I drove out to Maureen and Harlan's house. I didn't call ahead. I didn't bring anything but a folder. Alawan opened the door, surprised but not apologetic. Tobias stood behind her, sipping from a branded tumbler like nothing could touch him. "I brought you something," I said, stepping onto the porch. I pulled out the printed registration of Lynora Corp. And handed it to Tobias. "That was clever," I said flatly. Tobias shrugged, smirking. "It's just a safety net for the family." "Not your name," I replied. "Not your blood." Maureen's voice came from inside, sharp and clipped. "This isn't the time for this, Lynora." "No," I said, stepping forward. "It never is it? Not when I ask for answers? Not when you sign me away behind my back?" No one spoke. They didn't deny it. And somehow, that silence said more than if they had. After they disappeared inside, I stayed behind in the garden. Alawan came out after a few minutes, wrapping her cardigan tighter, like the wind had just remembered to blow. "You should have told me," I said quietly. She sat beside me, her voice lower than I expected. "Because you were dying, Claire, and someone had to carry the line forward. I was sick, not gone. I have children," she said, eyes fixed on the lawn. "You have scans." There it was, the math of it all, her family over mine, her future secured by my erasure. "You didn't save the family," I whispered. "You just saved your own version of it." She didn't deny that either. That night, I went home and didn't bother taking off my coat before opening my laptop. I uploaded every document I had: financial records, the will draft, the power of attorney forms, the Lynora Corp. registration. I named the folder, "For the day they deny me again." I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I planned. They erased me with paper. I'll write myself back in, with proof. The invitation came on a Thursday, tucked inside a pale yellow envelope that Alawan handed me in person. Her tone was flat, her eyes unreadable. "Mom thought it would be good to smooth things over." Smooth things over. They'd buried my name under documents and backhanded decisions, and now they wanted to smooth it over like it was spilled wine on a plastic tablecloth. I didn't respond right away. I just nodded, let her leave, then opened the envelope alone. Family Unity Dinner was printed in embossed gold lettering, like a wedding invite, held at Maureen's house. Sunday, 6 p.m. Casual attire. Family only. I showed up dressed like a witness, not a participant. Gray slacks, black blouse, hair pinned tight. No jewelry, no perfume, just facts. The house looked unchanged. Same floral curtains, same ceramic angels on the bookshelf, same scent of lemon pledge and meatloaf. Inside, the room buzzed with cousins I hadn't seen since before my diagnosis. Everyone smiled just a little too wide. Even Maureen looked nervous, stirring the green beans like they held the secret to world peace. Dinner was served buffet style, but seating was deliberate. Alawan and Tobias sat center, surrounded by warm chatter. I was placed at the far end of the table, near the pantry door. No one mentioned the last 6 months. No one asked about my treatment. Halfway through dessert, Alawan stood with her wine glass and smiled like she was on stage. "We just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began, "and especially Lynora, for her grace, her strength, and for supporting this transition." She signed without hesitation. "That's the kind of heart she has." I froze. Fork in hand, barely breathing. Tobias leaned back, met my eyes across the table, and mouthed, "It's done." I didn't speak. I didn't flinch. I reached for my phone under the table and pressed record. Back home that night, still in my blouse and heels, I checked my voicemail. A message from my bank. Ms. Mitchell, this is regarding a mortgage default notice. It appears a property in Yakima County has been registered under your name. Please call us as soon as possible. I'd never set foot in Yakima, never signed for any property there, but I already knew who had. I called back, confirmed the details, and when they mentioned the co-signer, Tobias J. Corbin, I simply ended the call. Sat there for a full minute. Then opened my laptop. I compiled the audio of Elowin's toast, the mortgage documents, the LLC records, and named the folder Proof. Then I drafted a letter to Vince Marwood. Dear Vince, I hope this finds you well. Attached you'll find the original toast, mortgage fraud evidence, and asset manipulation records. I trust you'll understand the implications. You erased me with paper. I'll return the favor, with proof and patience. Sincerely, Lynora Mitchell, I sent it certified, tracked, delivered. 2 days later, my phone lit up with a voicemail from an unknown number. A low, raspy voice whispered, "Check the mailbox outside your grandparents' basement door. Something you should have gotten long ago." I didn't hesitate. That evening, I drove over after sunset, parked at the curb like a stranger. No lights were on inside. I approached quietly, pulled open the old metal mailbox just below the stairs, and reached in. Inside was an envelope, yellowed, no stamp, no writing, just weight. I opened it in the car. A copy of a will dated 2 years ago. My name was listed in bold, clean ink, co-beneficiary, unaltered. I traced my name with my finger once, then folded it carefully and placed it on the seat beside me. They thought I'd stay quiet, but even buried voices echo louder when they come with signatures. The call came just after 9. I was folding towels, a mindless task that helped keep my thoughts from chewing me alive. The voice on the line was shaky, like it hadn't been used in a while. "Hey, it's Jeff. From back in high school. I work part-time at Jensen and McCall in records. I found something you'll want to see." I stopped folding. He continued, "It's the original will, the pre-edited one. You're listed, clearly, bold font. Your signature was there too, then disappeared in the final version. I don't know what they're doing, Lynora, but this isn't right." I thanked him. Calmly. My voice didn't waver, but my heart beat like I just sprinted uphill. I had suspected. I had gathered. Now I had proof. And I had a plan. The family event was announced 2 days later. Another gathering, this time to celebrate Tobias and Elowin's new home. "Legacy in motion," the invitation said, like a bad political campaign slogan. I wore a muted red dress. Nothing flashy, just enough to say, "I'm still here." I didn't expect a warm welcome, but I didn't expect the ambush either. Tobias stood up mid-meal, glass in hand, wearing his usual smirk. "None of this would be possible without Lynora's grace and sacrifice," he said. "She's shown us what it means to care more about family than formality." I froze, fork midway to my mouth. Eyes turned. Some nodded. A few clapped. A camera clicked. Someone taking a picture of me, sitting in the corner, like I belonged in a museum, titled Donors of the Past. Elowin smiled like she meant it. I smiled back, but not from joy. 48 hours before that scene, I was sitting in a notary's office downtown, getting certified copies of the will Jeff had sent me. I checked the metadata. It all aligned. Timestamps, digital signatures, version history. Nothing altered, nothing questionable. I prepped 3 envelopes, one for Maureen, one for the county archive, one for the editor at the Tribune, just in case. Back at home, I printed my own transcript of Elowin's toast, along with screenshots of Tobias's mortgage fraud, and labeled them accordingly. Not backup, insurance. That night, I called Vince Marwood. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice cautious. "Lynora." "Hi, Vince. Just wanted to let you know. I have the original will, full metadata log, certified copies, and a list of people you'll be CC'd on when I go public." He didn't answer right away. "You don't want to destroy your family's name," he said finally. "You already did," I replied. "You just used better stationery." The line went dead, and I smiled. Just a little. Back at the event, the clinking of glasses died down. Conversation returned. But the air shifted. A few eyes lingered too long on me, as if they sensed I wasn't clapping along for the show. I stood, lifted my own glass. To legacy, I said, voice calm, sharp enough to cut through the hush. May the truth of it never hide under someone else's version of grace. The claps came slow, uncertain. A few stopped halfway. Maureen's jaw tightened. Tobias looked away. Alawan's smile never broke, but her knuckles went white around the stem of her wineglass. They didn't know what I'd do next. That was the beauty of it. Now that they smiled while I burned, it was time for them to sweat while I stayed silent. It was early May when the package arrived. Small, padded, no return address. Just my name, written in the neat, upright handwriting that could only belong to Maureen. I stared at it longer than I needed to before opening it, somehow already knowing what it would contain. Inside the velvet box was the bracelet. It was the one she'd promised me for my 35th birthday. I remembered her holding it out months ago, during one of those quieter moments between tea and television. To the strongest girl I know, she'd said, her eyes soft but distant. But it had never come. And now, here it was. Delivered without a note, with a weight I couldn't explain. Engraved along the inner curve were those same words. To the strongest girl I know, love, Grandma. I held it for a long time, not because it comforted me, but because I finally understood. Alawan must have taken it, tucked it away when I was too weak to notice, too distracted to care. That was always her way. Hide the evidence, then reappear once the fire died down, acting like it had never existed at all. This time, I wouldn't wait for the flames to settle. That evening, I laid every piece of documentation across my kitchen table. The original will Jeff had uncovered. Screenshots of Tobias's LLC filings under my name. Scans of the power of attorney. Medical fund restructuring. The mortgage fraud in Yakima. And now, this bracelet. My history in stolen pieces, finally gathered in one place. I sealed 3 sets of it in matching folders. One for Maureen, one for Harlan, one for Alawan. I didn't send them. I hand-delivered them. The next morning, I called Maureen and said I was coming by to clear the air. She sounded hesitant, but agreed. By early afternoon, I was sitting at their kitchen table, across from 4 familiar faces. Maureen, Harlan, Tobias, and Alawan. I said nothing. I simply slid the folders across the table, one by one. Alawan reached for hers first, flipping it open with too much confidence. Her expression shifted by the 3rd page. Her mouth opened, ready to pivot, to explain, to lie. But I was already pressing play on the video. The room filled with Maureen's voice from last year. My estate will be equally divided between Lynora and Alawan, because fairness isn't optional in this family, it's the foundation. Tobias flinched. Maureen's hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled. Harlan didn't blink. Silence stretched between us like a rope pulled too tight. Harlan finally spoke. Where did you get this? Archived server, I replied. Unedited. Time-stamped. Verified. Maureen still didn't look at me. Alawan stood suddenly, the scrape of her chair shrill in the quiet. This is manipulation, she snapped. You think some old video changes what matters now? Tobias leaned forward, calm as ever. That video doesn't change legal reality. No, I said, meeting his eyes. It changes something more permanent, reputation. I stood. You played your part well, I said, all of you. But stories have a way of rewriting themselves when enough truth leaks through. No one tried to stop me as I walked toward the door. Not even Maureen. Outside, I paused on the porch. The wind had picked up, brushing through the trees like whispers. I looked down at the bracelet on my wrist. Tight now, but still mine. I pulled out my phone and typed one word into a text to Vince Marwood. Delivered. Then, I deleted his number. I didn't cry. Didn't look back. As I stepped into my car, Clouds rolled in above, heavy and gray. The kind that didn't just threaten rain, but promised a storm. And for the first time in months, I welcomed it. I didn't need them to say sorry. Their silence screamed louder than any apology could. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up to a silence that didn't ask for interpretation. No voicemails, no apology texts, no fabricated explanations from Elowin or Maureen. Just stillness, like the whole world had decided not to pick a side, because it already had. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of lukewarm tea and replayed the night before. The way Maureen's eyes dropped to the floor. How Harlan looked through me instead of at me. The stunned hush that followed the video of her own voice declaring I was supposed to be part of this legacy, part of this family. I didn't expect an apology. I hadn't for a long time. But I still held out some sliver of something, that someone would try. That maybe silence didn't mean dismissal. It only took 3 days to prove that sliver dead. On the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees outside my apartment, I returned to the voicemail I hadn't deleted yet. The anonymous one. The one that said, "Check the mailbox outside your grandparents' basement door." I drove over just before dusk, parked at the far end of the street, and walked around the back of the house like I'd done 100 times as a child. The metal mailbox, long rusted at the hinges, creaked when I pulled it open. Inside sat a single yellowed envelope, no name, no markings. I opened it right there under the dim porch light. It was an earlier version of the will, stamped, notarized, dated nearly 2 years ago. My name was there, bold and clear, listed alongside Elowin, co-beneficiary. Exactly as Maureen had once said, exactly as she had pretended to forget. Signed, sealed, intact. The breath left me in one slow, measured exhale. They'd gone to such lengths to erase me that they'd forgotten to destroy what had made me real to begin with. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with Vince Marwood. His office looked smaller somehow, more brittle. His assistant smiled too much when she let me in. He stood as I entered, but only out of habit. "I have something to show you," I said, placing the document on his desk. He didn't touch it, just stared. "This version was never submitted," he finally said, voice tight. "No," I replied, "because you were paid not to." His jaw shifted, his hands folded. "This can't be." "It is," I said, placing a voice recorder on the desk between us. "And I want a written statement, acknowledging you knew this version existed, and chose to act otherwise." He stared at the recorder for a full 10 seconds, then nodded once. I left with his signature an hour later. That night, I drafted an email. Subject, revised legacy. Recipients, family group thread. Every cousin, every aunt and uncle, every in-law who'd ever pretended not to notice what was happening. Attachments, photos of the will, Vince's signed statement, screenshots of the LLC, the recorded toast, and one message. This was never about money. It was about being erased. Now I'm back in ink. I hit send and closed the laptop. Not out of triumph, but finality. 2 days passed before Anitra, Maureen's longtime housekeeper, left me a voicemail. "She's been sitting in the kitchen all day," her voice cracked. "Still wearing that old sweater you gave her years ago. Holding the bracelet. Hasn't spoken. Just stares at the door." I played the message twice, then sat with the phone pressed to my chest for a long moment. "She doesn't have to say it," I whispered aloud. I heard it already. Redemption never came in words. It came in what they couldn't say out loud anymore. The envelope arrived on a Monday, marked with the emblem of the State Bar Association. Certified. Signed for. Held by a delivery man who didn't even glance at me. I opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once arranged birthday cards and hospital bills in piles labeled urgent and someday. This wasn't either of those. This was now. Inside was confirmation. Vince Marwood was under formal investigation. The will, the forged filings, the conflict of interest. His name was now where mine had been absent for so long. Under scrutiny. It didn't bring back the lost time or the stolen peace of mind, but it made the story public. It put one man where he belonged, under oath, under pressure, under a light he couldn't dim with polished charm. I placed the letter beside my tea and looked out the window. The sky was overcast, but not heavy, just gray enough to keep things honest. Later that day, I scrolled through my phone and saw the news. Tobias's company account, Liner Corp., was frozen pending legal review. The bank had received a report of fraudulent identity use and unlawful appropriation of medical funds. My anonymous tip had found its target. No headline used our names, just a case summary. Assets tied to a Spokane-based financial advisor were temporarily seized this morning due to pending claims of elder exploitation and medical fraud. I didn't celebrate. I just sat quietly, feeling something shift inside. Not relief, not vindication. Just room. Room where pain had taken up residence for too long. At 2:07 a.m., a voicemail lit up my screen. It was Elowen. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered. "I thought we were protecting the family. I don't know what I thought anymore." There was no apology, just fear dressed in excuses. I deleted the message before it ended. The next morning, I stood at my bathroom mirror. My hair was starting to grow back, short, soft, uneven. No scarf, no makeup. Just skin and scars, and a woman who was no longer anyone's victim. I reached for the bracelet Maureen had once meant as a birthday gift, the one she tried to return like a favor once the damage had been done. I clasped it around my wrist, not because it meant forgiveness, but because it was mine. In my desk drawer was a folder labeled Next. Inside were sketches and notes, plans for a nonprofit legal aid center for patients like me, people whose names had been hijacked, whose trust had been converted into contracts, whose silence was monetized. It wouldn't be flashy, it wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine. That afternoon, while buying groceries, a woman in her 70s stopped me at the produce section. She looked down at my wrist, then up at my face. "I read your story," she said, eyes wet. "I knew someone like you once." She didn't fight back. I smiled gently, nodded. Then I fought for her too. Some fires burn things down, others burn things clean. The park was quiet, like it remembered how much I used to cry there. Early summer in Spokane had a way of softening everything, the light, the grass, even the memories. I sat on the same bench I used to collapse on after chemo sessions, wrapped in layers and uncertainty. This time, I held a notebook instead of nausea, a pen instead of prescription bags. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation, 2 weeks since I watched Maureen avoid my eyes, since Elowen walked out with fury disguised as dignity, since Tobias tightened his jaw and said nothing, because silence was the only shield he had left. No one had called, not one person from the family thread. And oddly enough, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt open. Later that afternoon, I was back at my apartment, watering the plants I'd neglected for too long, when I heard a knock at the door. No delivery expected, no neighbor in need. I opened it and blinked once. Maureen stood there. No envelope, no fake smile. Just the bracelet I'd left behind on her dresser months ago, dangling from her fingers. "You dropped this," she said softly. I stepped aside. We didn't hug. We didn't greet. We just sat on the porch. The wind carried faint smells of cut grass and barbecue from someone's backyard. 15 minutes passed in silence. Finally, she spoke. "We forgot to protect you," she said, not looking at me. Or maybe we chose not to. I didn't answer. Her hands, now thinner than I remembered, held the bracelet like it still had something to say. She didn't offer an apology, but she didn't have to. Not when she placed a folded document beside me, a clean copy of the most recent will, with my name restored. She stood. "I should go," she said. "Thank you," I said, voice steady, "for showing up." That night, I didn't sleep. Not out of stress, but stillness. The kind that creeps in when the storm has finally passed, and you're left with the debris, but also the air. The following week, no new messages, no surprises. But I did catch a headline while scrolling local news on my phone. Family finance firm quietly dissolves after internal review. They didn't need to say whose. I knew, and more importantly, so did they. I saved the article, not for evidence, but as a quiet bookmark to a chapter that had finally closed. One morning, I found myself journaling again. It had been years since I wrote for anything other than clarity. This time, the words came easy. I didn't want them to love me like before. I just wanted them to remember I existed. And they do, now. Every time the silence lingers too long. Every time the phone doesn't ring. Every time someone at the grocery store looks at them a little differently. Sometimes, presence is restored not with words, but with absence that refuses to disappear. Love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it just sat across from you, broken, but finally facing forward. The sun had barely risen when I unlocked the glass door of the small brick building on the corner of Oak and Lynora. A breeze slipped through behind me as I stepped inside, flipping on the lights. No ribbon, no welcome banner. Just morning light pouring across clean floors and empty desks. The sign out front had gone up the night before. The Ledger Foundation Financial Justice for Patients. I stood alone in the stillness, breathing it in. I didn't need a crowd. This wasn't a launch party. It was a homecoming. By mid-morning, I'd answered 3 emails, reviewed 2 intake forms, and taken 1 walk around the block with my coffee in hand. My phone stayed silent, as expected. No calls from Maureen, no texts from Elowen, not even a stray voicemail from Tobias. And for once, the quiet didn't sting. It didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like autonomy. I checked my inbox again. Nothing new. Then I smiled and closed my laptop. They could keep their silences now. I had mine, and it finally belonged to me. Later that afternoon, the front door chimed. An older woman stepped inside. Mid-60s, gray curls tucked beneath a scarf, eyes sharp behind thick glasses. "I got your flyer at the community center," she said, holding it up. "Says you help people who've been taken advantage of. Especially family stuff. I figured if that wasn't you, it wouldn't be anybody." I offered her a seat, and she sat with care. Her hands trembled just slightly as she pulled papers from her purse. "My son forged my name, took out a loan. I didn't even know until they came after my house." I listened, nodding as she spoke. The story changed in the details, but the heartbeat was the same. "You're not alone," I told her. "I started this place because I was you once." She looked at me like she wanted to believe it was possible to start over. I showed her a path. Not just legal, human. That night, I returned home as dusk settled across the street. Inside, everything was simple, uncluttered. I brushed my hair, now chin-length, and paused to look at myself in the mirror. There was the scar, the softness around my eyes, the lines no cream could erase. I slid the bracelet around my wrist. It no longer felt like a memory. It felt like armor. "I didn't survive to be celebrated," I whispered. "I survived to be of use." Before bed, I opened my drafts folder. At the top was a message never sent. To Maureen.Mitchell email. Subject, just this. "I forgive you, but I'll never forget. I love the version of you who loved me back. That version lives in me now." That's enough. I hovered for a moment, then clicked save. That too was a choice. This wasn't the legacy they left me. It was the one I wrote from scratch. Sometimes, the people we love the most are the ones who forget how to love us back. And sometimes, family isn't who shares your last name, but who stands beside you when you have nothing left but your name. If this story taught me anything, it's that silence can be a tool, or a weapon. I learned that being erased isn't the end, unless you let it be. We don't always get to choose how we're written out of someone's life, but we can always choose how we write ourselves back in. To anyone watching who's ever felt invisible, dismissed, or quietly betrayed, I see you. You are not alone. You are not weak. Sometimes, the strongest thing you'll ever do is refuse to disappear. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to rebuild something alone? Your name, your place, your peace? What did it teach you? If this story spoke to you, drop a 1 in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't? That's okay too. Tell me why. I want to hear your story. If you found even one moment in this video that made you pause, think, or feel something real, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing true, powerful stories that matter. Because healing doesn't just happen in silence, it happens when stories are heard. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.